Hey guys, it's me Lachlan. I'm here today with a brand new Battlefield 4 video with some fresh gameplay, and this gameplay is specifically from my new Double Up series which will be hitting the screen soon, and that is soon to come. But today I'm here to talk about helicopter balancing, and what we're going to go over today is how helicopters should be balanced and designed for Battlefield 4, and how helicopters' opponents should necessarily be altered in order to cater for a better overall aerial experience. So to start off with, I'm going to talk about the current state of helicopters in Battlefield 4 and clear up a common misconception made within the game. So this common misconception for me at the moment is just how powerful helicopters are. Now some people think that they are ridiculously underpowered and literally have no purpose in the game whatsoever, but I believe that that is false. Now if you look in the gameplay that I'm showing you right now, we actually performed fairly well in an attack helicopter, and we could have done this in a transport heli or a scout helicopter equally as well. Now the problem with helicopters is that you really need at least 2 people to be inside the helicopter in order to maintain a strong aerial presence. In the attack helicopter especially, it's important that you have a gunner and a pilot who are working extremely well together. You can spy out enemies and be a very effective team. You can even go for a good 20 minutes in a helicopter, which is what we managed at this time. But whatever the helicopter happens to be, including the transport helicopter, like I mentioned, it's important to have at least 2 or more people. A transport helicopter will work in your favour as the gunner and the pilot can work well together in order to make that effective team nature, in order to counter-actively prevent the capturing of objectives. If you're a transport heli, you hover above the objective, you protect it as much as you can and allow your teammates a good spawn point. Now if you're a scout heli, equally you can be a repair tool man if you're a second person, and that means that the scout heli stays in the sky for a lot longer, and also you can even whip out a rocket launcher to also be effective as an aerial threat in twos. Now although I've mentioned how effective helicopters can be, it's not to say that they do come up against a very mighty task force. Now Battlefield 4 is well equipped with multiple ways to take down a helicopter, and it makes for a very frustrating experience in helicopters. Now in Battlefield 3 the story was a lot different. Taking down helicopters was far more difficult, it required more skill and more tactics about it, and Battlefield 4 has kind of lost that due to the amount of power on the ground. So to start off with, when we look at Battlefield 4, we already have all of the vehicles, including tanks and transport vehicles, which of course all contain mounted guns, as well as the actual tank shells themselves, which are very capable of taking on a helicopter and taking out in a single hit, especially considering the staff shell, which travels at a much faster rate, means that helicopters should stay very far away from tanks at all means possible. Now like I mentioned, we also have the transport vehicles, which have attached guns, some of which have attached grenade launchers. Now although the range isn't fantastic, still effective at doing some, even though maybe little damage towards a helicopter. Continuing with vehicles, we have the IFV, or Infantry Fighting Vehicle. Now the IFV is capable of using TDW missiles, it also has a mounted machine gun and knocks out 25mm shells at a very fast rate. This can also be changed up to use different kinds of more explosive shells as well, which really does add to the capability of taking on a helicopter. Now the TDW missile can also lock onto a helicopter if a SOFLAM is engaged by a recon player, which makes for an even more crippling experience. Moving on, we also have the AA tank, which is probably one of the most powerful weapons when it comes to talking about helicopters. They have a gunning position which allows you to use bullets to take on helicopters at a fast succession, and can even take them down in a single burst at close to mid-range, which is a real shame. It also has lock-ons, which can include active radar as well as heat seekers, and all of this makes for a very difficult time being a helicopter, especially considering how limited countermeasures we have. And even moving on with vehicles even more so, seeing as it's under the classification, are ground units. Now ground units are things such as mounted machine guns on the ground and mounted rocket launchers on the ground. These are classified as vehicles, even if they probably aren't vehicles, but anyway, those can also add to the difficulty of being a helicopter. There are mounted machine guns which yet again are perfectly capable on the ground of taking on a helicopter at close range, which is a really troubling experience. Moving on to infantry, you can see regardless regardless of the class, that there is always some efficient way to tackle an aerial vehicle or most vehicles in general. Now even when we look at the assault class is equipped with a 3GL and a grenade launcher. Now although these may not be the best weapons when we're looking at ground units except for maybe transport vehicles, but when we look at aerial units, these grenade launchers are perfectly capable of causing some damage, and most of that damage is in the form of mobility hits. Now mobility hits definitely falter how much a helicopter is capable of maneuvering, as well as knocking it off balance. Now a grenade launcher hit at mid to close range will definitely knock a helicopter pilot off of their balance, assuming it hasn't killed them on impact, and that will make it crash anyway. So even the slightest mobility hit has probably already held a helicopter's doom. Now if we look at the scout helicopter or even the transport helicopter, where sticking low to the ground is important, you can see that a mobility hit from any of these grenade launchers is definitely enough to cause some serious damage and possibly even take down the entire helicopter itself. Now we move on to Engineer, which is probably the most efficient class, if not the most efficient class at taking on vehicles in general. It definitely is well suited. We have all of the rocket launchers. This includes tracking rocket launchers which follow your signals, such as the S-Roar. This includes heat seeker lock-ons, including things such as the Stinger, and this also has things such as free firing rocket launchers such as the RPG. Now all of these are capable of destroying a helicopter or giving it a large mobility hit which will take it down or destroy it, and definitely 2 shells from a Stinger, or 2 shells or 1 shell even, depending on the damage already taken, is enough to ruin a helicopter completely. Now the Engineer class has also gotten a recent add-on in the form of the Naval Strike DLC called the AA Mine, which automatically locks on and destroys targets, which is a real shame as well. Another piece of equipment which was completely unnecessary. Although it isn't very effective, it's still yet again another way of taking on a helicopter. It's not necessary, but was added by DICE anyway. Now moving on to support, we can see a slight downtone but also a slight upturn in how a helicopter is approached. Now support arguably is the least useful for taking on a helicopter because it only really has C4, but it definitely is a supplier in the demand for removal of aerial vehicles. Now we can see that a helicopter can be taken on by engineers, assault, and even possibly recon to a certain degree, and the support class provides all of the ammo to make that a possibility. Now recently we have seen that grenades have been held back a little bit to stop grenade spam. I'd like to see something similar implemented for support in order to remove how many rockets are allowed to be picked up, as how efficiently they're allowed to be picked up. They supply the demand for rockets for engineers, which really does make a tough life for us pilots. And finally we have the Recon class, which yet again is one of those supplying classes to how helicopters are destroyed rather than actually taking them on themselves. Now you'd have to be really skillful to snipe a pilot out of the driver's seat, and to be honest with you, if you do that, you probably do deserve the vehicle destroy itself. But to be honest with you, the Recon class is only really capable of spotting out and locking onto them. Now a SOFLAM is used to automatically lock onto the vehicles in the air, which allows certain types of missiles, such as the TDW, which previously wouldn't have been a lock-on kind of missile, to automatically assume the target and take it down. Now this is a very unfortunate aspect. I think the SOFLAM doesn't necessarily need to be in the game, and it's just another way where we face some kind of difficulty from a class which is already pre-standing and already has the SOFLAM at its availability as soon as possible within the early stages of recon accessibility. Now what you have to bear in mind as well with all of these infantry units is that they of course all have the benefit of vehicles, and of course all have the ground unit vehicles, which means that they can pick up machine guns that are mounted and still cause a lot of trouble. Regardless of just how efficient they are, it's still damage, it's still a big shame, it's still very difficult. So next I'm going to show you all of my proposals as to how to fix the problems that we are facing as helicopter units. Now some of these you may disagree with me, but to be honest with you, I want you all to go get into a helicopter on Battlefield 4 at least 2 or 3 times in a few games and tell me just how wrong I actually am. It's ridiculous what we're facing at the moment, and these changes I feel as though are necessary, some of which are definitely arguable. So to start off with vehicles, tank shells I feel should have a higher aerial drop. So for example, the IFV or infantry fighting unit and the MBT / main battle tank, their tank shells should retain the damage that they have, but the drop on them when aimed in the sky should be far more significant. Now tanks are capable of mounting themselves on hills in order to aim up at the sky and get a good grip on helicopter pilots. Now, if the overall drop of those shells was far more significant, that would help us a lot. Now, on the ground itself, tank shells are actually pretty maneuverable. You can aim up just a little bit of your target in order to hit it, but in the sky, they actually travel at a really fast rate, and I think that's a problem at the moment. Tanks becoming more of an issue for us. Next, all mounted machine guns on all vehicles, including the ground-based units that are dug in and automatically there, as well as things such as the transport vehicles, should have their damage reduced by 2. Now, every single time you're in a helicopter at lower levels, which includes the scout heli and of course the transport heli, the amount of fire that you come under just from these machine guns is enough to take you out in itself. Now, these machine guns, although aren't very capable or very efficient, considering the amount of vehicles and how many there are, at lower levels you really are in some trouble and you'll possibly have to avoid them as much as you can. So just this slight damage drop I feel as though is necessary. Now here is the most controversial one, and I think that this is a possibility of completely removing the AA tank itself. Now it is arguable that that should be the case, some people will say otherwise, but if we're not going to remove the AA tank, I think it should have a huge power drop, a really significant one. Drop the range of the cannon, because even now, regardless of the recent buffs, it's still very long ranged, and drop the lock-on capabilities range as well, because you can be locked on a multiple number of times from an extreme distance, and I don't think that that's necessary. I think it really does ruin the flow of gameplay. Now, if not, if you don't want to do all these range things, if you don't want to remove the tank completely, make the load times a lot longer. Now the reload time for a cannon, if it was firing at that rate in real life, would be a lot longer. You'd have to cool down very significantly, and that isn't replicated in game at all. As well as the lock-on time, getting missiles into that reload chamber, especially all 4 of them, considering the damage and size of them, should be longer. I'd say about anywhere between 60 seconds to 120 seconds, so a minute to 2 minutes. I think that's necessary. Some people will say otherwise, but at the moment the AA tank is the most overpowered weapon in the game when it comes to taking on us vehicles, and I think it's just, it's not necessary. In Battlefield 3 there was no anti-aircraft tank capable of taking you on such as the efficiency of this one, and that made for an overall widely more enjoyable experience. If you look back to Battlefield 3, you won't remember being taken down as easily and as quickly, and I think the AA tank is the largest contributor to that. So, next up, we're going to have a look at the Assault class and all the other infantry classes, and particularly with the Assault class at the moment, I feel as though it's not a case of how much damage, but just how effective the damage is. Now, when we're looking at the grenade launchers, including the 3GL and the normal grenade launchers, you can see that the mobility damage is the main problem. It's not the actual damage caused, because if you think about it, hitting a grenade launcher on a helicopter at mid to close range does still require somewhat a level of skill, but it's just how effective they are at making a helicopter lose balance. Losing balance is the main problem that we have at the moment, because it's not necessarily how much damage is being done, but how effective it is. I mean, I'm being knocked out of the sky on a regular basis because I've been hit by missiles, let alone actually being destroyed by the missiles itself. So that's just a slight buff that I feel as though is necessary. Now when we look at the engineer, now this is the most difficult one and lots of things need to be changed here. I feel as though the effectiveness of the engineer class needs to be rapidly reduced. So to start off with, I mentioned leaving the AA mines at their effectiveness now, because AA mines aren't necessarily that bad. They're actually a really good placement, and they don't have this sort of overpowered level that people were expecting them to have. But when we're looking at the rocket launchers, I feel as though free-firing missiles, including, for example, the RPG, should only have 2 shells. They have about 4 right now. I feel as though 2 is necessary, because bearing in mind, free-firing rockets are effective on the ground as well as in the sky, so 1 for the ground, 1 for the sky, or 2 for each. I think that's perfectly fair. Next, with the lock-on missiles, and this does include the Stinger and the Javelin, I feel as though only 1 missile should be included, a Stinger and a Javelin at this point in time, for vehicles on the ground and vehicles in the air, are just ridiculous. I mean, Stingers can take out a helicopter single-handedly from anything between 0 to 400 meters. I think that is completely unfair. The Javelin has 4 missiles, which is capable of taking out any kind of vehicle on the ground, or if so flammed, some in the air from any kind of distance. It's roughly 400 to 500 meters again. It's really, really powerful. And if not, if we don't do the whole removal of rockets and put it down to 1, at least get rid of the range a little bit, cut it down by about 100 to 150 meters to make sure it's only close to mid-range helicopters that are suffering from this, you know, sort of level of damage. Because if we're being locked onto at a close range, we don't have time to deploy countermeasures, because bearing in mind there's other aspects of people who are locking onto us. We don't have time to either deploy them or get away fast enough. Now, if I'm at 0 meters, if I'm literally right above you or within a couple of meters of your fire, and I deploy countermeasures to shake off a helicopter's missile, including maybe your missile as well, in the time it takes for you to reload, I feel as though I need necessary time to escape the lock-on zone. I need time to get away from the area, to remove myself from that hotspot, and hopefully that should stop the amount of times we're being destroyed because of lack of countermeasures. This will be the new countermeasure, thinking effectively to get yourself out of the hot zone. So the support class at the moment isn't necessarily much of a worry. I feel as though, yet again, reduce the time it takes in order to pick up a missile, similar to that of what they've done with the grenades. And for the recon class, possibly reduce how long a SOFLAM can last. Now, if you put one down, it can last for arguably the whole game. Make it about 4 or 5 minutes. I think that's fair. I don't think the SOFLAM's necessarily much of a worry at the moment, only when used effectively. Now look, my overall goal of these changes is to make it a level turn. Now, as you can see from the footage at the start of this gameplay, to be an effective helicopter, you have to have 2 effective players who are willing to work well together, and that will be the difference. That will be why the helicopter isn't taking out the sky. Now, I feel as though if that level of effectiveness and that level of teamwork is required for a helicopter, that ground units, including vehicles and infantry, should have to work together in the same way in order to take out a helicopter. Now, I remember on Battlefield 3, you'd have a good few people gearing up as an engineer, changing their class to an engineer to help their team on the ground to get rid of that helicopter menace. That doesn't happen anymore because there's so many potential influences and targets to take out a helicopter itself. So if the level of effectiveness on both sides is equal and the level of responsibility and the level of skill required is equal, that makes for a much more fair fight. It means the helicopters get their turn to be a bit more effective in game, and it means that people on the ground have to work just that little bit harder in order to take out the helis themselves. So if you're at this point by now, you've done incredibly well. I've been talking for over 15 minutes now, and that is a really long time to be listening for. So if you have hit this mark, well done to yourselves. Thank you for watching. Of course, I don't usually do videos for this long. They're usually about 8 or 9 minutes, but sometimes there's just so many points to cram into a single video that I find it quite difficult. And I like to explain myself a bit more than other people do when elaborating on their ideas. So guys, it's been me, Lachlan, as always. Thank you for watching. I'll be seeing you again with another Battlefield 4 video.